My great pleasure to welcome to the University of Wyoming, Professor Leith Davis of Simon Fraser University in Canada. You just see how cool she is in crisis. Dr. Davis spent her early childhood in Wyoming, and I don't know if she actually remembers the weather when she said she'd come back. Then she came back to Laramie in 2011 for the International Conference on Walter Scott, and that was the time that the bus stopped on the top of the snowy range, right? And the lights went off at the library during presentations, and yeah, here she is. So, to the conference. Dr. Davis is a leading scholar of Scottish and Irish literatures of the 18th and early 19th century, and a scholar and practitioner of music and dance. She's also become engaged this past few years in repatriation discussions with regard to native artifacts held in London. And that's a matter that's much in our minds, as one of our own UWyo students is seeking to return the tribal headdress, currently at the British Museum, to Wyoming. And this is a discussion I think that we can hold in mind today as Dr. Davis considers the aftermath of one people's loss and displacement into the distant and native spaces of other peoples in the 18th century. Our scholarship has and should have impacts in the world, and I think that's where your scholarship has gone really powerfully recently. Dr. Davis's wide interests and commitments have produced numerous important books, such as Acts of Union, Scotland and the Negotiation of the British Nation, 1707 to 1832, and Music, Post-Colonialism and Gender, The Construction of Irish Identity, 1724 to 1824. She also co-edited the volumes Scotland and the Borders of Romanticism and Robert Burns and Transatlantic Culture. She's currently working on mediating cultural memory in Britain and Ireland from the 1688 Revolution to the 1745 Jacobite Rising. So the talk that she's going to have today is around that 1745 forward. The International Companion to Scottish Literatures of the Long 18th Century is in press, so a very busy academic career, productive career. And if that wasn't enough, I hear she's now studying circus in the late 18th century, so you should ask her during question time. Professor Davis directs the renowned Scottish Studies Centre at Simon Fraser, and at my first conference there, the plenary speakers were processed in by pipers. It was stunning. We can't quite manage that here, but I think the weather in that part would be great. And our welcome is warm even if the weather is cold. Dr. Davis is joining us for Scotland Week to speak on the unexpected trajectories of a story we think we know, the aftermath of the 1745 rebellion. It's a little bit Outlander, perhaps, but it's a story that resonates as far as Jamaica and not as romance. It's a story that we're keen to learn. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Davis to speak on Before Outlander, Networking Jacobites in 18th Century Scotland and the Diaspora.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for inviting me to come and be part of Scotland Week. Thank you so much, Kelly, for your expertise in managing the technology here. Much, much appreciated. It's wonderful to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay, that's good. If I start to fade, just give me a signal from the back there that my voice is too low. So it's great to be here. As Carolyn mentioned, I was a resident of Laramie, Wyoming. In fact, that's me right there at the tender age of 6 in front of the dinosaur. So it is wonderful to be back and to see the changes and some of the similarities that I remember. I'm joining you today and I'm bringing greetings from the Center for Scottish Studies at Simon Fraser University. And before I start my talk, I just want to acknowledge that the work that I've been doing with my students at Simon Fraser University is on the unceded territories, the territories that were never given away by treaty of the Coast Salish people. So that's the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and also the Squamish peoples. And a huge shout out to my colleague, Dr. Amy Parent, who has put together a film called Unsettling Land and Water at Simon Fraser University that explains how the First Nations came together on the mountain, and the territory of the mountain was shared between those groups.
Leith,
So,
ask if you can stand that direction because this camera is sort of pointing down.
Yeah, I kind of get kinetic when I'm walking around. Try rooting myself in place. And also just a shout out to Amy Parrish, who's also part of the repatriation team that's bringing back the pole. It's actually in the National Museum, Scotland, and she's working with a team to bring back that pole to her peoples, the Nisga'a peoples and the Nils Jewel family from whom it was taken. And I'm happy to talk about that again afterwards. So, I'm talking to you today about a project that I'm invested in greatly and obsessed about, one could say, in fact. It's a project that is being funded by the Social Science and Humanities Council of Canada, and I have partners who are the Digital Humanities Institute of Simon Fraser University and our Research Institute, as well as the National Library of Scotland. So it's been such a great privilege and honor to work with a team of scholars and graduate students on this project. And we have been working with this manuscript. It's a manuscript that is an 18th-century manuscript compiled by an Episcopalian minister who had a parish in Leith, Scotland. And being an Episcopalian, he was associated with the Jacobites, and he also was a minority religious figure. So bear that in mind. Episcopalianism had a different meaning in those days. He was a Jacobite and also minority religious figure. So these are the materials that he collected that are about the 1745-46 rising in this manuscript. And our team is working in order to bring attention to the manuscript itself and the materials. We are digitizing it and encoding it, and we are analyzing it qualitatively as well as quantitatively. So it's a particular focus that we are taking on the stories of the women, of Gaelic speakers, and of laboring class individuals within the manuscript. That's our focus. So today I want to tell you a little about the manuscript and its context and what we're doing. And my talk will unfold in 4 points. I'm going to start by talking about the context in which the manuscript was created. I'm going to move on to talk about what's inside of this manuscript and why it's so exciting to us. I'll tell you a little bit about our project, and I'll try not to get too technical about the digital humanities aspect of it, but I'm happy to talk about that also in questions. And then I also want to talk a bit about the results that we have. The project is still underway, but these are results, some of which we have already, and some of which we anticipate. And hopefully by the end of those 4 parts, I will have excited you as much as I am excited about this manuscript and project. So let's start with the context, Robert Forbes and the 1745 Jacobite Rising. Just a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the Jacobite Rising? How many of you might be familiar with it through the works of Diana Gabaldon and Outlander? And we are eternally grateful to Diana Gabaldon for making us not have to explain Jacobite Rising as many times as we would normally have to do. She's brought it into the popular consciousness. But I also want to make sure you know some historical details about it. So I'm just going to give you a little bit about it. Don't trust everything you read in this novel. So Jacobites were a section of the population after 1688. There was a revolution in Ireland, Scotland, and in England that put William and Mary on the throne, Protestant from the Dutch Republic and his Protestant wife. They displaced a Catholic monarch, James II. Those people who were still in favor of James and supported James were known as Jacobites, from the Latin for James, Jacobus, so they were called Jacobites. One of the things that is really interesting about Jacobites, in that it has become quite clouded over with the Hanoverian perspective that we've got of history, is that the Jacobites were constantly operating in order to restore the Stuarts to the throne between 1688 and 1745. So we hear about the risings, in particular military conflicts, 1708, 1715, 1719, and 1745. We hear about some of these, but this was a constant upheaval, constant diplomacy or military activity that was taking place to restore the Stuarts to the throne, and that's really important to bear in mind. In 1745 to 46, the leader of the Jacobite rising at that point, it turned out to be the last rising, was Charles Edward Stuart, bonny Prince Charlie, looking very bonny there in this painting. And he started the latest rising when he landed on the island of Airside, July 23rd, 1745. Now, Forbes, being a Jacobite, and who had Jacobite leanings, tendencies, and friends, was very excited when he heard about this. So he set out from his parish in Leith in order to join the Jacobite troops. He didn't get very far, however, before he was arrested. And he spent the Jacobite rising first here in Stirling Castle and then in Edinburgh Castle. And you can see they look like impenetrable fortresses there. So that was his experience of the rising. While Forbes was in jail, however, the Jacobites went from victory to victory. They marched down to Derby, and this is about 120 miles or so outside of London. And then they stopped at Derby and they turned back and they retreated to Scotland. And you probably know the story after that. The Jacobites were sorely defeated at the Battle of Culloden, April 16th, 1746. Now, Forbes was luckier than many of his Jacobite friends. He was actually released from jail about a month or so after Culloden, and he took up residence again in Leith. But it was a changed world for the Jacobites. So this was a time of continued military occupation in Scotland. There were, in fact, about 3,000 men, women, and children who were taken prisoner and were kept in the prisons and shipped down to England. There were so many prisoners to process in the legal system that lots were drawn. 1 in 20 people were taken to trial, and the rest were transported. There were over 120 executions as well that took place in England, including several celebrity executions by lords, so peers of the realm, who were executed as well. This was not a comfortable time to be a Jacobite. And I should also say that this was accompanied by a media frenzy, an event, we could call it a media event, that was deliberately designed to dampen interest in the Jacobites, to present the Jacobites as always having failed or had been doomed to fail, and drawing on some of the anti-Scottish prejudices of the time to really write history in the moment that it's being created and to present the Jacobites as ultimately doomed to failure. These media items included racialized representations of Highlanders and also Irish Jacobites too. And this is what I talk about in my recent book, Mediating Cultural Memory in Britain and Ireland, that came out this year. So I focus on this in the 1745 rising in particular, and that's what brought me to the Forbes manuscript, in fact. Now, In contrast to this propaganda that is being circulated by the government, Forbes took an angle of trying to create an alternative history. So Robert Forbes invited people to his residence at Leith, and he would interview them. He collected accounts from people who had been witnesses to events, and he also obtained documents related to the Jacobites' perspective. And he collected these and put them together. He filled 10 volumes of material between 1747 and 1775. In particular, he filled 8 volumes in the first 5 years, so that was the time of his most collection, talking to people and witnesses at the time. The manuscript amounts to 2,148 pages. It is indeed a phenomenal kind of cultural memory that he's creating. And each volume, as you can see here, this is the first volume here, but each volume has a title page there that has a date, it has an epigraph, and it also has the volume number that's included there. So we'll be setting these up. These are not manuscripts that are ephemeral at all. This is meant to be kept and to be stored as an alternative memory. There you can see an example of the page that is open here, and you can see, fortunately for us, is very legible handwriting there. So let's go on and talk about the contents of this amazing manuscript and the 10 volumes. What's inside of these? Well, it starts, first and foremost, with an execution speech. And Forbes did collect and write out by hand the speeches that were given by Jacobites who were executed. So the speeches that they would give before they were hung, drawn, and quartered, or in the case of the lords themselves, before they were beheaded. So you can see here, for example, this is the speech of Robert Lyon, who was presbyter at Perth, and he was executed at Penrith, October 28, 1746. Forbes also has 2 versions of the Lord Balmerino's speech. One that he notes is from the Lord's own handwriting, and they're slightly different in those, and I'm happy to talk about that difference too in question time. As well as these speeches, he includes accounts of people who helped Charles Edward Stuart escape. So between the end of the Battle of Culloden, April 16th, and September 1746, Charles Edward Stuart managed to evade the government troops, despite the fact he had a £30,000 reward on his head. He managed to escape because he had people who were loyal to him, who led him from place to place and sometimes in circles. And Forbes collected the stories of these witnesses and people who helped him escape. So he collects, for example, a journal that's just like a daily diary from Flora MacDonald. And Flora MacDonald, of course, helped the Charles Edward Stuart escape from Benbecula to Skye by disguising him as her maid, Betty Burke. There's an image of Charles Edward Stuart dressed up as Betty Burke there. Forbes also collected the account of a person who would become a famous Gaelic poet, and that's Alexander MacDonald, or Alistair McFester Alistair. So he also helped Charles Edward Stuart on his journey. And Forbes takes his account several times and interviews MacDonald at the same time. One of the amazing things about the manuscript is that it gives us accounts as well of laboring class individuals. And this is an example here. This is the account of Edward or Ned Burke, who was a chairman. So he carried a sedan chair in Edinburgh, and he was part of the part of the prince's entourage and was kind of an entertaining figure for Charles Edward Stuart. So his account is written down by Forbes from Burke's handwriting and also from the UWyo book. We are not advancing.
No. Everything we just did.
Does it work now?
We're still stuck with this. Does it work by hand?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah, I tried to get the toolbar to hide, but
Oh, okay.
does it work?
Can you go back to the way it was earlier?
Yeah.
I know the toolbar at the top is a little annoying because it takes off the some of the text there.
Is it still?
Click towards the computer,
I
not
think
towards
just
the
it's gonna
screen.
have to be a lovely assistant. That
Okay.
makes sense. Thank you.
Leith, you need to, towards that computer he's on, not towards the screens.
That works.
Yeah,
Kelly.
yeah.
Okay, let's try with. Will it work now if you give it this way? No.
No.
Maybe at the bottom so it doesn't cut off as much of the.
That would be great. Let's
Okay.
try it. Does that work?
We're all trying.
No, that doesn't work either. Okay. All right, you know what? Does this mouse advance it?
I think the
Okay, just a
Click
space
it.
bar.
arrows.
All right, so I'm going to come over there and I'll leap over here so you can see me.
Do you want me?
Nope, I'm good, yeah. So we looked at the execution speeches, we looked at these accounts of Charles Edward Stuart and his escape. Also, we have narratives of war crimes and atrocities, and these are difficult reads, honestly, in this manuscript. So I'm not going to go into them too much in detail, but just to give you an example that's not one of the worst examples, there's oral testimony from Mrs. Robertson, Lady Itches, as she's coming back, and she lives not far from the battlefield of Culloden. As she's coming back after the battle, she went home to her house called the Leith, that's the name of it, within a mile or so of the field of battle upon the road. As she went along, she saw heaps of dead bodies, stripped naked and lying above ground. When she came into the close, some of the soldiers came about her, calling her a rebel bitch. So this is the kind of attitude that was common at the time, and Forbes does his best to record the experiences of people who have been witnesses of things. He includes as well oral testimony of one Patrick Grant. He was a Gallic speaker, so there had to be a translator during this interview. And he notes that poor Patrick Grant was pressed into service, military service, for the British government and forced to go to North America sometime in 1759. So just another example of the kinds of stories that Forbes wants to collect. He also includes songs and poems, a sort of miscellaneous group. And just to give you an example of this, there's by a lady extempore upon the riband, which the prince wore about his head when obliged to disguise himself as a female in female dress under the name of Betty Burke. So there's a poem to commemorate that event, which the Jacobites saw as a representation of the prince's ingenuity. There are also numerous letters, and these are probably the bulk of the manuscript. So letters that Forbes wrote, letters that he had given to him, and copies of letters sent out by him, replies. These are wonderful because they give us information about networks and who wrote to whom, where the letters came, where they went, et cetera, et cetera. Just again, to give you one of these examples, and this is one of our group's favorite, There's letters from a Mrs. Ann Leith, who apologizes about her penmanship. She says she's a bad pen writer. She also says she calls her writings baffles, and hopes that she says she will be kind of uneasy until the baffles get to the place where they're going, come to Forbes's hand. Now, despite her complaints about her penmanship, she was actually somebody who ministered to the prisoners in Inverness, and she has some really valuable stories about her experiences with the government troops there. There's also that group that Forbes himself calls the etc. And these include items from periodicals such as the Scots magazine, epitaphs of some of the players in the Jacobite Rising. You can see here Forbes has moved the page around to try and approximate the stone, the writing on the stone there. Another one of our favorite items is a grocery list of what the Jacobites bought when they went down to Derby and back to Culloden. So Forbes found the account books of James Gibbs and just copied down everything that the Jacobites bought, what they ate. They ate a lot of mussels, but some ginger and some interesting other items that give us a sense of food studies of Jacobites. In addition, there are two printed works here. There is the Book of Prayer, a common office, and there is also a kind of secret history of the Jacobites called Alexis, which was in fact based on an account by one of Forbes's interviewees, Alexander MacDonald Kingsgrove. And last but not least, by any means, this manuscript has built-in relics. So Forbes includes pieces of fabrics, as you can see here. There is a piece of the Prince's Garter. There is also fabric from the gown and apron string that Charles Edward Stuart wore when he was escaping as Betty Burke. These are pasted into the volume. In addition, on the backboard of volume 4, there's actually pieces of a boat, little splinters of a boat, and this doesn't approximate it, but it's actually three-dimensional, where Forbes pasted in a bit of the boat that Charles Edward Stuart used to escape. Now, as you can see, this is a multimedia text, and this was really interesting to us as we began to work with this text. It's also a way of Forbes preserving Jacobite cultural memory, and he's very deliberate about this. So he notes, for example, that he has an anxiety to make the collection as complete and exact as possible in a piece of history that must kind of be lost. His suggestion is he has to compile it all to bring it all together here for this most remarkable and interesting event that ever happened in any age or country. So his own sense of the responsibility here we see is huge. He's meticulous in details, fortunately for us, as he writes, in the event of a history, the recording of proper names and surnames will prove mighty useful in order to strengthen and fix the facts in opposition to all contradiction or cavilling. As in point of fact, and I love this in particular, one can never be too strict and nice, especially in an age when even glaring facts are most impudently denied and contradicted with the greatest boldness. That's something we can take on board, I think, in our own age as well. Now, one of the things is Forbes didn't just compile this material, he also read it out to people who would meet in Leith at his Citadel residence. So he's in the process of using this material to create and to strengthen the connections of the Jacobites who are still part of the community. So he's creating community as well as preserving community. Despite this volume being read out frequently, it remained hidden during Forbes's lifetime. And he notes he keeps it hidden because he is keeping it concealed, so he's not afraid of its being seized by enemies here. He kept it well hidden, and eventually, and I'm happy to go into the details because we've actually unearthed some different history about the provenance of the manuscript in our project. But it was eventually presented to the Advocates Library in 1871 by Robert Chambers. And the Advocates Library, of course, is the precursor to the National Library of Scotland. It was used, and there was a printed version that was created in 1895 to 96. It was edited by somebody called Henry Payton, and it is this printed version that I think kept knowledge of the manuscript in circulation. So what also happened, however, is that the manuscript itself became what I call an included manuscript. Because there was a printed version, people turned to the printed version for their knowledge of Forbes and his project, and they just left the manuscript languishing in the Advocates Library and the National Library. And then, December 2019, I decided for my book I wanted to go and see the actual manuscript. So I did, and it was one of those eureka moments as a scholar. I had the books brought to me in the National Library of Scotland, and what I saw of this handwriting, this man's painstaking effort to collect things, gave me a completely different vision of what this project was all about. And it made me see just how much Forbes himself is invested in the project and is also a writer in this project. He is an agent of this project. He's also somebody who seems to be an agent who experiences a secondary trauma through the writing of it, and we were really interested in that aspect of it in our project. Which brings me to the project. Okay, I got so excited about this. I talked to the curator and I said, has anybody digitized this manuscript? Because it needs to be digitized. The printed version is just totally inadequate to give us a sense of the project. And he said, well, no, not yet, but why don't we do something about that? And so luckily over the next time that we were working on this, I had a research fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities in Edinburgh. So I was able to use the funds from that to digitize the manuscript with the National Library of Scotland. And it is in fact available to everyone on Simon Fraser University's digital manuscripts. So you can see it, you can see images of this manuscript by simply going to the university library's digitized collections there. And we wanted to take it further as well, because it's all very well to digitize it, but this is such an important resource for Jacobite studies, for Scottish studies, and I would argue too for British studies and global studies. And so what we decided to do was other steps in the process to do a qualitative and quantitative analysis of it, and to create a website, a web resource that would include the manuscript as well as ways of searching it and creating your own data from this manuscript. Hence, we embarked on a partnership in a time of COVID with the National Library of Scotland, and we divided up the tasks that had to be divided up because we couldn't actually go over to Edinburgh at that time. So the way we divided it, the NLS team was tasked with doing archival research into Robert Forbes and also finding other material connected to him and talking about the representation of the manuscript as a treasure in the National Library of Scotland. So looking at the provenance of the manuscript. The SFU team took on board the tasks of doing the qualitative and quantitative analysis, and we have been working to use the text encoding initiative which is a way of standard for representing text in digital form, and it uses XML markup, so it's very interoperable, which is very important for us to be able to connect with other projects. We've created TI files, text encoding initiative files, for each one of the items that Robert Ford collected. And we put them together in a facsimile viewer. So this is what we work with. Now, in order to do this, we've also undertaken transcription of the manuscript. We at first tried a program called Transcribus, which is handwriting recognition analysis. We're surprised with it, about 80% accurate, which is pretty darn good. But, and here's the interesting thing about the digital side of things, the RAs were much more interested in working with the manuscript and doing their own transcription. It engaged them more. They felt that they connected and understood the stories more by doing that. So we turfed Transcribus, which we still had to do some editing with anyway. And we've been doing the transcription by hand. We're up to about volume 5 now. In addition, we're also putting together a database that is linked to the TI files that includes people, places, and organizations. So we'll be able to map out the networks that Forbes whom Forbes was communicating with, and we'll be able to visualize them and analyze them. Okay, and as I said, I'm happy to go into more gruesome details about the digital side of things if people are interested in that. But I want to move on to talking about some of the results that we've found already. First and foremost, I think what we found with the digitization of the manuscript and what we're trying to do is really to draw attention to the affordances of the manuscript. And in the course of that, we found out about new affordances that we didn't realize about beforehand. So in particular, we have discovered through doing this digital analysis that the kinds of information management techniques that Forbes used are in many ways very similar to what we do in the digital world and the digital humanities. And just to give you a brief example here, Forbes uses what we call 18th-century hyperlinks that were invisible to us until we started thinking about footnotes. We knew what he was doing, but we weren't thinking of these as particularly part of that information management in this way until we started to digitize them and to realize what we had here. So you can see there are these hyperlinks where he links back and he links forward to other items within his long manuscript. We're also using these tools for both close and also distant reading of this manuscript. And for just examples here, the digital humanities tools allow us to extract and combine in otherwise impossible ways information about, in a very granular way, about who mentioned whom in their narratives, who gathered together in the Jacobite cause, where and when, who wrote to whom, what route the letters took, who carried the letters. We can find out about how objects circulate in Jacobite networks. And we can also see what kind of transnational, national, and local networks that Forbes was creating through his project. Our project also brings new avenues for investigating the global connections of Jacobites. And here, just to mention a few things, Forbes attempted to track down the fates of the Jacobites who were transported. So of the 19 out of 20 who were transported, who were sent to either the American colonies or to the Caribbean. And what we find is a really interesting evidence and indications of the ambiguous role that Jacobites played in the Empire, the British Empire. So one of the accounts that Forbes includes is by Alexander Stewart. And Stewart writes about his sufferings. He was captured, he was a servant of Charles Edward Stewart. He was captured after Culloden, taken to Perth, Edinburgh, and Carlisle, tortured, threatened with execution. He drew lucky number 17 for the lot, and he was then taken to Liverpool and transported. He ended up in Maryland. And in Maryland, interestingly enough, there were Jacobite networks. So for Stewart, the captain sent out letters to all the Roman Catholic gentlemen who was our friends. And those were the people who came and basically bought him and his companions. So he did not fall, as he said, in the common buckskin's hand, for so the people that are born there are called. These gentlemen bought 84 of the 88 that was on board of our ships. And then Stewart himself managed to be bought by men in Maryland who were all followers of Charles Edward Stewart. He returned to Scotland in March 1748, and as he knows, only one other person he knows came back to Scotland through that route. So in Stewart's case, the Jacobite networks ended up saving him. Patrick Grant wasn't as lucky. He was one of the Glenmoriston men, one of 69 Glenmoriston men and 12 Urquhart men who were imprisoned after Culloden. And as he notes in his narrative, those who did not die on shipboard or in prison were banished to Barbados. 2 of them have returned. They left only 16 of their companions alive in Barbados. So you can see the very different kinds of roles that Jacobites played here, both being part of the slavery networks and being themselves forced labor. This is an ambiguous position of Jacobites, and I think it's one that tells us a lot about the global role of Jacobitism and global connections. And it's interesting because at the time that they were transported, the Jacobites were sent and transported, taken to the West Indies, supposedly where the pretender is out of the question, in order to become useful subjects. So they're being shipped out, and so they can be somehow they're rehabilitated through the work that they are forced to do. And this is written by Philip Stanhope, Lord Chesterfield. I also want to note Forbes himself lent money to James Bailey, a Glasgow merchant involved in the slave trade in Jamaica. So he himself had connections with another Jacobite who was also part of the slave trade. A fourth thing that I think we get from our project here is a new understanding of the role of cultural memory and amnesia in constructing the history of the 18th century. And just in particular for us, an ability and a new focus to focus on marginalized voices within the Lion and Mourning and within 18th century British history. And here I've been reading this wonderful book by a Canadian writer, S.A. Aduchin, and it's about cultural memory in terms of Black storytelling in Canada and globally. And I just wanted to, I read this and I thought this is just such a wonderful quotation. And I wanted to acknowledge the work that she's doing and also to think about this in a broader context for many stories as well. And she writes, to ask us to re-envision history is to urge us to weigh newly under threads of the story, and maybe that act can change the story. So I think just to conclude, we are involved in trying to change the story of the Jacobites, including the complicated histories that they played in global British Empire, as well as finding the voices, individual voices that have become lost to history. And I think I'm going to end that.
And then invite some questions.
Can you, do you have a sense for the religious makeup? In my mind, they were all Catholic. We just heard that Forbes was not.
No.
Do we know how many other denominations might have been represented as Jacobites?
There were Catholics, there were lots of Episcopalians, there were some Presbyterians, Church of England, so there were not just Catholic. I think that's one of the propaganda myths that was really circulated just during the Jacobite period in the 18th century. Very anti-Catholic, and so they were using this idea that all Jacobites were Catholic in order to really turn the population's sympathies against Jacobites. So definitely not all Catholics.
If I may follow up?
Yeah.
So, and you probably already covered this, but Forbes' intent in doing this work
Yeah.
was to counter that PR campaign, or whatever you might call it, that anti-Jacobite effort. Is that correct? Was that his motivation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. To me, that's definitely what he's doing in retrospect. At the time, I feel that he wanted to collect those stories and to preserve them. He knew, and he writes about this, how history is going to be changed. They are going to be erased. These perspectives are going to be erased. He's very, very aware of that, and that comes across clearly. So I think his project is to preserve that as much as he can in the voices of those people who experienced it. And this is also one of the really interesting things about Forbes, that he gives such credence to oral histories at a time when print is the medium of value and authenticity. He's bringing in the stories of Ned Burke. He's bringing the stories of the steersman who rode Charles Edward Stuart around in the 8-oared boat. He's collecting these stories in different ways, and he's giving credence to these oral narratives as well. So he's an oral historian as well as somebody who collects documents. And I think that was what the wonderful thing, and also the most challenging things for our project, trying to digitize that. How do you digitize a piece of a boat? So we're coming across ways in which we're also changing the TI. We're also talking about the Text Encoding Initiative and some of its assumptions about dealing with text. So we're taking our project to two conferences about Text Encoding Initiative and Digital Humanities. In fact, one of them was a very interesting conference that was done online with avatars. So Joey Takeda, our Digital Humanities Innovation Lab programmer, and myself attended a conference as avatars, so we had to kind of go online and find our way through this conference site. So it takes us in all kinds of directions.
So I have something to extend that question. Does Forbes also collect English voices? Because Mary Pittix made the argument that there were plenty of English Jacobites, right? And that part of the story does not get told. Or is his network very specifically Scottish?
Yeah, interesting. The stories that he's collecting are stories of people who are around him or who come through Leith, or particular figures like Flora MacDonald. So not so much the English side of things, but what's interesting is that he writes to Bishop Horan in London. And by the end of the 10 volumes, it's basically letters back and forth between Gordon, who's another Episcopalian minister in London, and Bishop Forbes, and they're having a dialogue about really what seems to be still their sense of loyalty and their sense that Jacobitism, this is another thing that we found reading these narratives. Jacobitism is a spiritual practice. People honestly believe this as a restoration will happen because this is it's the will of God. One day there will be another restoration. There's already been restoration, there'll be another one. And so the accounts that we're reading are, I think, very moving because they're facing death, but so many people just believe in that kind of providence. So we get that network. He writes to people in England, doesn't necessarily go out of his way to hear the English voices, but the voices that we do here give us a really personal perspective on affiliations with Jacobite. These are very moving stories. We have to be a little careful because some of them are traumatic, and I think Forbes himself must have been traumatized through rehearsing these and hearing these stories again. It's interesting. We have, I should say, we also have a network of people working on this. So our team has spread out and connected with scholars in food studies, trauma studies, tourism studies, multidisciplinary group, and we are putting out a book of essays, a collection of essays, re-envisioning, shaping Jacobitism. So bringing those different disciplinary perspectives together.
Yeah.
I came across a letter last summer that kind of addressing an overlapping story. It was written from Adam Smith in about 1750 or 60. I haven't printed it, but it was addressed to a bishop asking about the history of Scotland when he was doing his research for the Gulf of Nations and on morality. And so I was wondering if, I don't know, maybe the Jacobites might have played a role in the Enlightenment, James Watt and Adam Smith, their writings. Any thoughts on that?
That's a big question. You're asking me kind of a revisioning of the history of Enlightenment, what I think we need to have anyway. And Kelsey Williams does a really interesting book on kind of earlier Enlightenment that sees it as more Catholic. So that's really interesting. Yeah, complicated in so many ways. Hume, for example, the connections they had on a social level were connections with Jacobites, right? Hume, Smith, et cetera, they would have had people in their remit. So I think there's a really interesting way to rethink how we think about the Enlightenment that would go that direction, that would look at social connections. Yeah, I'm going to stop at that because it's such a big question. Yeah, it's such a big question. Interesting.
Oh. Tanya.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the initiative to get it digitized as a librarian. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
My question is
I'm
on
so
the
grateful to
database.
libraries.
Is that the database that you've created? Is that publicly accessible as well? Or
Everything will be,
internal?
yeah. And the database is done with TI, so it's also interoperable in different ways. We're hoping that we can also piggyback on other projects.
Great. I'm fascinated to see what is underneath that.
It will all be open access, and
Great.
I think our real sense is that even though we're working with scholars from different disciplines, we can only envision certain things with the manuscript, but there are many other projects that people will have in the future that we want to enable and to give them the resources to work with. So that's our hope, really, to make this open access. It will be open access. We're also really doing a lot of public engagement with this project. So we take the stories to my students. I presented at the Highland Games in British Columbia for the last 2 years. We have music accompanying us that complemented the stories that we were sharing and telling people about Forbes and his project. And so really trying to bring in different audiences to provide historical content for people who have an interest in the Jacobites, who maybe read Outlander and thought, maybe there's history out there. We are the history. We are here to fill that role. So, yeah.
Could you explain the project just as a project? I mean, you're obviously starting with the core of this
Yeah.
collection of forms. How are you transforming it digitally? I presume it's more than just, let's take pictures of this thing. So
yeah.
could you give
So
us
the
a little bit of
encoding,
sense? Yeah.
what the encoding does, okay. So the encoding gives us an opportunity to, we put it into what's called text encoding initiative, and that represents the text. And it allows us to ask different questions and capture different information, so that we can say, okay, how many times is such and such referenced next to so-and-so in this manuscript, or in an account by so-and-so, or how many letters traveled and went through Perth. So it allows us to create a database of this information, not a database, it allows us to create this information and encode that information and bring all kinds of questions together with it. If we have internet, we can actually show you afterwards. If anybody would want a sneak preview of what it's going to be like. But it's much more than just searching, right? Search, you only find the words as they show up. What we're trying to do is to conceptualize different questions that one could ask about this manuscript. And we're trying to set it up in such a way that we can involve different people of different disciplines who will be using this manuscript and bringing different perspectives to the Jacobites. I think, yeah, we have a core of people who are working on this already, and I think we are shifting the narratives of the history of the Jacobites, even as we're going forward with the project. And the project probably talking another year or so.
You keep using the word multidisciplines. Could you describe the disciplines?
So we have historians, literary scholars, food studies, who we have Marissa Nicosia, who's working on that grocery list, for example, and she's analyzing it in terms of food studies. We have Kevin James from University of Guelph, who's looking at the tourism aspects of the Jacobites, so kind of following through what's even mentioned by Forbes. He talks about how his wife wanted to come up to see the places where Charles Edward Stuart was, and suggesting kind of early tourist networks there. We also have Aaron Peters working on trauma studies and the Jacobites. It's a collection of essays that's coming out with Edinburgh University Press next year.
Okay, thank you.
It gives you a few of them there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Till nose and pausing.
So along this line, I think I really appreciated as a researcher, especially in literacy, when you talked about, quantitative data, and specifically like as a true researcher, like showing us that you cannot just historian write and talk about it, but actually with the data, right? And we know that, like you said, how many times one word we came across. I think those things bring so much like history. You can see what was this person thinking about at that time, how many times they used. My question is, was it hard to pick one tool for analysis? Like, some people may use digital, some people may use handy, that works perfectly and you want to check, one by one. So were there any other analysis that you wanted to use or map that you wanted to utilize?
We will be using maps. We're also including the TI is something that's used for the map of early modern London, and Joey Takeda, who's our developer, has worked on that project. So we use the TI encoding because it's interoperable, because it's something that allows us to do numbers of things. So we're not just word searching, we're asking bigger questions than that. And we also wanted to use something that would be longer lasting as well. TI has been around for a while. So we discussed how we go about it, and Joey is a mastermind of TI, and so he's really set up the encoding schema for us, and myself and my team of graduate students have been working to encode things, and as we encode, we discover different things about the manuscript, which we hope to share.
Megan?
Thank you. So I was curious, one of the letters when you talked about the penmanship wasn't that great, maybe not having that great of literacy. Were any of the letters in this, the Forbes in Gallic, or were they collected as oral histories, or is a Gallic person even attempted to write a letter?
Yeah.
And then I was curious, there's Gallic studies people working on this project?
Yes, thank you. Yes, a great question. So there were no letters in Gallic, but there are Gallic informants. And I think I mentioned to you one earlier who had to have an interpreter there. It's a wonderful moment in the manuscript because Patrick Grant is obviously speaking, I think his name, Alexander MacDonald is talking to. And they're speaking in Gallic, and MacDonald is responding with Grant's story, telling Forbes what the story is. So you see that process of translation happening. But he also says something, and the two men laugh together. And it's kind of like one of those moments where you just wonder, what were they really saying? So you get the sense of Forbes himself being a medium and something happening behind the story. So were they saying something about Forbes? What were they laughing about? And so, so Forbes spoke to Gallic speakers, got their story, but they were translated. So they're definitely mediated. What's also interesting is that he learned some Gallic names from Alexander MacDonald, Alistair McVester Alistair, the Gallic poet. And so he talks about kind of learning about Gallic and uses some words from Gallic in his own, because he adds little notes everywhere himself, footnotes, kind of he is there very much in this manuscript. So we have traces of Gallic connections, and Forbes himself writes to people up in the islands and highlands. Our project also involves 2 Gallic speakers, and we are also working with an Irish Gallic speaker too. So, thank you for that.
Charlie and then Scott, and I think this will be our last question.
I recently heard a talk by Professor Tom Devine, who said by 1822 at George IV's visit to Edinburgh that the Jacobite cause was no longer a threat whatsoever, which enabled George and all of Scotland to embrace Highlandism. What caused the Jacobite cause to die out after 46?
Yeah, that's another great question, a big question. So from what we see in the manuscript, it wasn't a done deal for Jacobites. There's clearly evidence of the attempts to restore, and as I was talking about earlier, the belief in a restoration. A couple of things happened. One of them, you can see some indications of in what I was talking about regarding the Jacobites in exile. Jacobites profited from the British Empire in many ways. And so because they were profiting from the British Empire, that also conflicted with the Jacobite desire to dissolve the Union. So Jacobites' own experiences with empire, positive empire, kind of had that impact. And then we see ways in which Jacobites were also refurbished and represented in literary works too. So even before 1822, I would argue, by the end of the 18th century, Jacobites are looking pretty good compared to the French Revolutionary rebels. And there's a lot of comparisons, and there's an idea of trying to rehabilitate the Jacobites and their memory, and also to bring in current Highlanders into the empire as members of the empire. So a lot of it is kind of the global picture, I think, of the Jacobites on the global stage that is responsible for that. But I think we're too quick to see, that's the last Jacobite. They didn't go, oh, well, that's the end, folks, let's pack up and go home. No, it kept on, the hope kept on, but the propaganda presented it that way, like this is the end. There's nothing, they were doomed to failure anyway. And I actually find, sorry, he was going on a tangent here. I actually find that Outlander just interesting that way too, because even though the character knows what happens and goes back and tries to change time, those darn Jacobites, they still fail. So it sort of reinforces that sense that they were doomed to failure. Even in the future, they were doomed to failure. So interesting. Scott?
I was just curious, since it was published 150 years after the manuscript was written, like what are some of the big differences, like what they decided to publish versus what's in the manuscript?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one of the things, as I suggested, was just the lack of presence of Forbes. Everything he says as a footnote is kind of put in small italics. And the focus is, it's like an edited volume of the collection of these narratives instead of what it is when you see the manuscript. Forbes' writing goes this way, it goes this way, he comments. It's basically also his calendar. So he says, on July 29th, 1749, have dinner with so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so, and Mrs. Carmichael at the Citadel. So all of that kind of fades away. The presence, the embodied presence of Forbes is eradicated in the print. Instead, it becomes just a 19th century collected edition of Jacobite papers. And so I think for me, so much of what the project is Forbes curating, intervening, choosing people. He must have been kind of annoying guy too, because he wants all these details. Like, tell me more. But you said this last time, but how can this be true? Because you said this time. So obsessive. Maybe I'm obsessive too, though. So, anyway, but so that all gets lost with that printed version, and instead it becomes identical when a narrative beyond the other. But Forbes writes large when something concerns him, or he wants to emphasize something. He writes smaller at other times. So you see his presence so much in that manuscript, and it gets totally lost in the printed version.
So I want to thank Leith Davis for a fantastic talk.